Martin Weiss, the Holocaust, World War II. Marty is one of my Holocaust survivors, Jewish Holocaust survivors, featured in my film, Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembered. Folks, this has everything to do with our military veterans because how they were liberated at the end of the war. Marty was born in Czechoslovakia, and he was put in a ghetto when the Germans took over Czechoslovakia. And he was in a ghetto with his family. He was later imprisoned in the Auschwitz-Birkenau killing camp, they call them, in 1944, where his mother and two younger sisters were killed, were murdered, actually. He was then taken to the Mauthausen concentration camp and was forced on a death march in 1945 and March of 45 until he was liberated in May of 45 by the United States Army. Folks, what I just shared is tremendous. It's a tremendous story. You need to watch Marty's story. Henry Greenbaum is my other survivor that I've featured on my channel. I have a couple of dozen of them. And I want to thank Chet Howard. Chet is a person just like you and me. He's out there with a heart for our veterans, with a heart to tell the history of what's happened, World War II, and he's helping me re-edit my film, The Holocaust Remembered. So Chet, thank you. I look in this camera, God bless you. Thank you for your love for our country and our veterans and these Holocaust stories. Chet told me to pick another Holocaust survivor, and I did. And he's sponsoring this story and making it possible for you to learn more about what happened in the Holocaust. Marty's story is amazing. It's so gripping. They're all gripping. The way he tells it, he was about 80 years old. He's still alive with us, born in 1929, like I said, in Czechoslovakia. He's 94 today. And he's just a great man. Carried one of the torches for the Olympics when it came through years back. But I got pictures of this at the introduction, so I hope you watch that. But Marty is just a great guy, and I love you, Marty, for what you went through. You talk about freedom, folks. These folks know what freedom is after having gone through what they went through. I interviewed Marty in Silver Spring, Maryland. It was February 9th, 2009, over 14 years ago. I also wanted to say that Marty served with the United States Army during the Korean War, so he is a United States war veteran also. If you want to sponsor a story like Chet has done, you can find information in the video description or on my website, larrycapetto.com. Click on Sponsor a Vet. You see all these pictures of veterans, include their name in the sponsorship, and I'll do the rest. If you want to donate to my work, there's information in the comment section of this video. Just click on the link there. So my heart's full, folks. These stories, like I said, I thank God for the ability to serve Him and my country through the lens of my camera the last 20 years. And you know, the Holocaust, like I've told people, is something I kind of ran from, but it's a story that we need to learn. We need to learn from our history. Things are happening in our world today that are alarming, that parallel what happened in Nazi Germany. And you and I, we can stand up, we can defy the tyranny, we can do something about what's going on in our country and hold on to the freedoms that we still have and get back what we've lost. Amen? All right. We're in a war, folks, just like our veterans were, and we're here to fight till we win. So God bless you. Thank you for watching, subscribing to this channel, and I will talk to you again. Where were you born?
I was born in Poland, Czechoslovakia.
Okay. What year was that?
1929.
Okay. Can you just give me a little history of your family growing up and as Hitler started coming to power and what began to happen with your family?
Yes, as I mentioned, I was born in 1929, and by the time, like in the mid-30s, I was like 6, 7 years old, and from there on in, I remember everything very distinctly. Things were, from my perspective, or my family's perspective, we were all we liked the way life was, only because prior to that it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And after World War I, it became part of Czechoslovakia. However, we lived in the eastern part of the Czechoslovakia, which was the Carpathian Mountains, or the Carpathians, sometimes known as Ruthenia. And I remember even when I was already in school, like 6th, 7th grade, there was like a good feeling. We were all very proud to be living in Czechoslovakia because we had democracy, where most of the countries in Europe did not. And even at that age, I understood the difference. Because like Hungary was next door, actually, and since it belonged to Hungary prior to World War I, a lot of people still, like my parents, for instance, my father served in World War I, I should say, under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so a lot of people spoke Hungarian, but the population where we lived were basically Russian or Rus. A little different than a Russian from Moscow, let's say, but nevertheless they were Russian or Rus. And we were very happy to be living in Czechoslovakia. The rest of the population was not. They felt they belonged to Russia because they were Russian. However, life was much better than most countries of Europe because we had, like I said, even at my age, we knew we had civil liberties and a lot of things that in other areas did not have. And also, there was some, every so often we kept on hearing, we were not far from Poland actually, and we kept on hearing of all the problems the Jewish people had in Poland because the Polish government was a dictatorship. It was anti-Semitic, very anti-Semitic, and they put all kind of laws, passed all kind of laws to prohibit Jews of practicing their religion or so on. So we felt, like I say, very, very fortunate. But in the meantime, around that time also the Zionist movement came about. It was getting strong. So I had older brothers. There was nine of us in the family. And I was number 7, so I was one of the younger. But my older brothers were getting more conscious of Zionism and so on. So we were always aware, but at the same time we tried to blend in more or less to the society of the time instead of staying. Even though we were Orthodox, everybody was Orthodox and very observant, which Jews were in Europe. But at the same time, we tried to sort of modernize ourselves. My sister was going to school in the city already, and my brothers left home. My older brothers left home, and they looked for greener pastures or, to get some kind of a new type of life. So we were all looking forward to a good life. And by the time I came around, my mother already had hopes that I would go to for higher education, which before was non-existent. So in that regard, there was a lot of hope until 1939. I still remember, March 1939, actually when Hitler took over the Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic, Prague fell, and so Hitler, or the Nazis took over that part, but the other part, our part I should say, and plus some others, were in a sphere of Hungary. So they wanted it back because it used to belong to them prior to World War I. And they were also Nazi allies, so they got parts of the spoil. So they occupied our area. Once the Hungarians occupied, as soon as they came in, we already felt very uncomfortable. First of all, with us...
Do you need your glasses?
No, I can take them off.
Really no, let's knock them off. No. Okay. No. Go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah. At any rate, the Hungarians occupied us, and immediately we were not very happy about it, as a matter of fact, and we sort of resented it, okay, to say the least. They closed our schools because they were Czech schools, and we had to go to actually they switched over a Russian school. Like I said, the population was mostly Russian, and the Czech government always allowed them to have separate schools because they felt like they wanted Russian schools. So they integrated us into the Russian school. However, we had a problem. We never learned, we knew how to speak Russian, but we didn't learn the alphabet, or we didn't learn how to read and write in Russian. But we were able to speak it because our neighbors were all Russian. So that was a problem. So by that time I was in 5th grade, I believe. And when we came into the school, it was also a very archaic system. They used more of the like a penal type system, where you came into, you didn't know a lesson or something, they would hit you and, you know, all kind of stuff like this, corporal punishment. So we were very uncomfortable with that. However, that's what was available. But as time went on, when Hungarians came in, they mobilized all the people to serve in the army. However, at first, actually, one of my brothers was inducted into the Hungarian army. But a year later, they started changing over, and Jews were automatically eliminated because they were undesirable. And they came up with all kinds of edicts. And right from the start, as soon as they came in, a Jew was not a Jew, but they would say, like a saying like, you're stinking Jew. That was like added to it. So in other words, you were never called a Jew, you were called a stinking Jew. You know, this was like in the fabric. And naturally, the more they did it, the more resentful we were. However, they were not very nice to the population either, because they were Russian, and they looked down just like the Nazis did, as they were inferior because they were Slavs. But this is only the observation from that time. So anyway, I mentioned my brother was inducted into the service, and a year later they had a change, and they, instead of inducting Jewish people, Jewish men into the service, what they did, they set up what they call labor battalions. Now these labor battalions consisted of, literally was a slave labor force. They were military age, anywhere from 19, 20 to 42. This was the mobilization of the country. So the people went into the army were the same age, and the people went into these labor battalions. Now what was about these labor battalions that most of the history just seems to omit, they took thousands upon thousands of people of that age and put them into these slave labor battalions. And I had 2 brothers there, and what they used them, they took them out to the Russian front, and they were using them for all kinds of dirty work, like chopping down forests so the partisans couldn't hide out. They were using them for picking minefields, burying the dead, but all immediately on the battlefield. You know, it was they were like in the back of the. But in the meantime, they were under army jurisdiction because they were like military, except they were not trustworthy to fight. They were just used for labor. And so many of them perished there because of typhoid and stuff like this. But a lot of them were lucky enough, they were captured by the Russians, or some of them ran over, you know, escaped. But once they got to the Russian side, what they did, they either joined the underground, or some went into the Russian army, but a lot of them from our area joined the Czechoslovakian Legion, okay? Now the Czechoslovakian Legion was established in Russia by a Czech general by the name of Svoboda. In fact, I had a second cousin. He was one of the early ones. He lived in the Czech Republic at the time. And he got hint that that the Germans were after him. So he escaped to Russia very early, like as early as 1940, somewhere around there. He left his family and all. And he was one of the founders of the Czech Legion in Russia with this General Svoboda. he rose to a high rank, like he was colonel. And when the war was over, he came back with Svoboda as the liberators. But the reason I mention it, a lot of these people, I have a brother-in-law that was in that group, but most of the young men that I knew that were in that predicament came back as soldiers, as liberators. Except I have one brother, he was captured by the Russians, and for some reason the Russians insisted he was a German spy. So not only did he spend about 5 years under Hungarian prison, like as a prisoner up on the Russian front, but then when he came over to the Russian side, they for some reason, somebody decided he was a German spy, so they put him in with the German prisoners, and they treated him as a German prisoner. So he ended up in coal mines in Asia and Russia. Unfortunately, he died years ago, and I never had a chance to talk with him, find out the details. Because before that, we never talked about it. He didn't complain, and I didn't complain.
Well, let me ask you a couple questions here. Okay, so you're growing up in the 30s.
Yeah.
And you're in Czechoslovakia, and Poland is invaded in '39, and Czechoslovakia too.
Right. Hmm.
I mean, did the Germans come and take you away, or your family?
No, no.
So you guys were spared.
This came later.
Okay.
This came later. Now, you see, no, actually, we were actually from Hungary. We went as Hungarians, by the way. We were not Czechs anymore. But once Hungary came in, we were considered Hungarian. But what happened is that. Once we were occupied, like I said, by the Hungarians, we kept on hearing stories. Oh, the reason I started with this, the labor battalions, because of a lot of people that were there. Every so often, one of them would come home, or sometimes people would just trickle down from that area. And we heard of all the atrocities that were taking place. Like, I don't know if you heard the term Einsatzgruppen. Okay. We heard of the mass killings in Poland and the Ukraine. We heard of all kinds of stories like this. Except now with hindsight, I can't explain it, but even though I was very young, we heard it, we believed it, but we could not believe it. I don't know if that makes sense. So we used to have a lot of we used to hear a lot of explicit stories, and then one day I met also again a second cousin. He was out there in Ukraine, and he came back on some kind of furlough. They allowed him to go home for some reason for a couple of weeks. So he came and he told us a story of what was going on, and we found out that he recognized one of our own neighbors that was volunteer for the Hungarian army, our own neighbors. He was a sergeant in the Hungarian army. He was committing a lot of those atrocities, okay? And we were not too surprised because we knew he was very anti-Semitic and he was a very nasty type of person. But nevertheless, he said that he saw him really commit a lot of crimes like this. So after the war, as a matter of fact, I ran into him, and he said, he would like to go. He came back as a soldier, by the way. He says the only thing he wanted to do was go back and kill that guy. Okay, so I tried to talk him out of it. He says, it doesn't pay. You're going back. The Russians. He was on the Russian occupation. We were in the Czech Republic by then. So he. Now that I talked him out of it, I tried to talk him out of it. That it's not worth it. That he should let it. But I always remember that. He was so angry. But anyway, we kept on hearing about the atrocities that took place, and the only reason we could not believe, as a human being, you could not imagine the stories we heard. So we knew we were in for trouble. So in the meantime, what happened is that, like I say, we heard of, like in Poland or Lithuania, from all those places, they picked up the Jews very early, like some places, 1940, 41. And at that time, Auschwitz did not exist. By the way, we never heard of Auschwitz till we got to Auschwitz. But we kept on hearing about all the atrocities, and but we could not imagine that the Germans were capable of doing something like this, in spite of the stories. Then we heard some very disturbing stories that from Warsaw, that what they were doing, they were taking people from put them in trucks with canvas tops, and they would pipe in the exhaust into the truck and literally drive around the city till the people died. In the meantime, what the Hungarians did, they, on a pretext that people were not full citizens, because they didn't live there like for 100 years. My family, or a lot of families, lived there for a long time. I don't know exactly how long. But so they picked up selectively families from different places, and they put them in rail cars and shipped them out to the Ukraine. And when they got them out to Ukraine, you have to remember, in winters. Now, we lived in an area where winters are very cold. They're very severe. It just so happened that during the war years, I remember every single winter was extremely cold. It was like very, very cold. And so much so, to give you an idea, we lived in an area that they used to bring the Hungarian troops to our town to train them for the Russian front, that they should be used to that type of, because we had the same type of terrain and the same type of weather, that they should be able to fight on the Russian front. So it gives you an idea how severe it was. So we kept on, so they took these families and picked them up, they put them in, they knocked on the door during the night, they gave them like an hour or two to pack, and those people, a lot of them were so poor, you know, they used to have, they didn't even have luggage. They had, they took bed sheets and literally put some utensils, whatever, they could carry. Some change of clothes, or a lot of them didn't have, you know, too much of anything. They took them out to Ukraine, and what did they do? They would have them disembark in a forest, and the snow was high, and they had, most of them had, in Europe, people had a lot of children. Like my family was 9. Some of them had like 5, 6 kids, 3 kids, but they're all young, you know, it were small kids. And they would disembark, and we kept on hearing stories. They let them loose. And then what happens, the Ukrainians, again, were not exactly, they were very anti-Semitic, the most hateful people towards Jewish people. And so much so that very often, not very often, many of them literally joined the Nazis, and they became the killers in the Einsatzgruppen. Most people don't realize that, but it was the Ukrainians, the Lithuanians, and the Latvians. I'm not going to give you a percentage because I don't know, but I know, like in some of the worst camps, they were the worst possible behaved people. They even behaved worse than the Nazis did. Okay. The only reason I bring this up, because some of this stuff gets brushed aside, and things are different today. You're afraid to insult these countries, and I say, hey, this is the way it was. Anyway, they took them out, and they dropped them off in the forest, and then they had to go, they had to move. The farmers didn't let them near, they would sick their dogs at them, and so on. And so what happened is that they marched around, and some of them, by the way, made it back. They trekked back, and they made it to our area. When they came, we tried to hide them, not many, but I tried to feed them or whatever. But this is when we found out about the mass killings, or the random killings. Like, what was worse than that, as they were walking around on a road from place to place. Now, I don't know if you were ever in a war zone, especially in World War II. Every place there was a crossroad or a bridge, there were sentries. Now, the sentries could have been German or they could have been Hungarian, because they were side by side. So wherever they went, they would run into these sentries, and they would, for fun, like I mentioned, my neighbor, for fun, what they would do, they would take, in Europe, a lot of the Jewish men had beards, okay? They would take a match and light the beard just for kicks, to have a little laugh. Or take a knife and cut, you know, to just take a knife, like, and try to cut the beard and so on. They would do all kinds of things to humiliate them. Okay, and this went on, and we kept on hearing these stories. Then some of the most disturbing stories were there was a river called the Dniester River. In fact, this cousin of mine that came back, he told us this story, so it wasn't like a hearsay from somebody that made it up. There were women with children. And these, by the way, were not necessarily the Germans. These were Hungarian troops. And they would come to a crossroad or a bridge. They would take the child from the mother and literally bash their heads in, or do even worse, which I'm not going to go into. And they would take them, throw them in the river, but they would not kill the mother until she watched them do it. Until they watched them do it to the child before they would threw the mother in. So the river obviously was floating their bodies like the whole time. Then the Germans got an idea. They got a bright idea, and they put up posters that they had a change of heart, or the Hungarians in that same area, and they would put posters on trees or a telephone pole that if they meet on such and such field, they would change of heart, they would send them back home. So people had no place to go, so a lot of them went to these fields, okay, wherever they had the signs. And when they came to the fields, they would gather them there. And as they were gathering the field, they would have them dig their own mass graves. Then they were bringing troops in trucks with canvas covered up, and they would back up, and they would open up the canvas, and they had machine guns going, and they just machine gun people. And this was when we were still home, okay? So all the things we heard, like I said, we kept on hearing it. We took it very seriously, even though I was very young. By that time, I was 12, 13, you know, so I was already involved in a lot of things that we were, you know, whatever we were doing. But we kept on hearing these stories, but again, we could not quite comprehend. As anyway, then we finally realized that we were in big trouble, that's just a matter of time something was going to happen to us. But this was already getting later. It was like early 1940. Now, as odd as it may seem, by 1944, I should say, like the beginning of 1944, as odd as it may seem, we realized that the Russians had a counterattack, and they were doing very good, and the Nazis were retreating. Okay, that was already, but we were still home. Okay, so as a matter of fact, we were still home in early of 1944. And I mentioned to you about the Ukrainians. Most people don't realize there were divisions of Ukrainian men that joined the march to Berlin to join the Nazis to fight in their army. Most people don't write about that. There were millions of them. I mean, not millions, but thousands of them. And they were still home, and they were retreating. And I remember one night as they were retreating, actually during the night, we were woken up by noise outside, and we heard people speaking in Russian. And we looked out the window, to the dark windows, look outside, and we saw they were in German uniform, but they were speaking Russian. And we couldn't figure it out, because we knew that the Russians were not that close that they would be here. So when we saw them in German uniforms, we really got worried, and we had no idea Ukrainians were in the German army, you know. So finally they knocked on the door, and we had to open the door. And they came in. Oddly enough, they asked for food or water or whatever, and we gave it to them, and they left. But next day, 25 divisions of Ukrainians, 25 divisions, march through and retreat with their cannons and their, their equipment. Most of them were horse-drawn in those days. And so that gives you an idea. We knew already that the war was coming to an end, so we figured, well, maybe we'll ride it out. But what happened that by April of 1944, the Hungarians decided to turn us over to the Nazis. By the way, all this time, we had nothing to do with the Germans. The Germans were not in our area. But what happened, you've probably heard of Adolf Eichmann. Adolf Eichmann was sent to Hungary for a reason. See, in Hungary, the Hungarian government considered the Jews as citizens. And being citizens, they didn't want to hand them over at first to the Nazis. But they had a change of government, and what happened is when Adolf Eichmann came in, he tried to negotiate. Hitler sent him to negotiate because he was very capable. And when he asked for the Jews, the Hungarian government said, oh, you want the Jews? Sure, we'll give them to you. So they took, in 2 months, they emptied out 600,000 Jews out of Hungary, okay? They shipped out to Auschwitz, okay, directly. By that time already, Auschwitz was an operation. So this is how we ended up. And when they picked us up, there was very simple. The police came, they picked you up, they took you to a ghetto, and we were in the ghetto a very short time, like to be exact, about 5 weeks, 4 or 5 weeks. And they put us on a train to Auschwitz, and we had no idea about what Auschwitz was. We knew we were in for big trouble, but nobody imagined the extermination part, okay? We knew people are gonna die, we knew people are gonna, but they said that capable people will work, and because of our labor, they'll be able to feed the other families. So when you have nothing to believe, you believe anything, So anyway, this is this part.
Tell me about the train now. Was this one of those trains where they pack you in really tight for 3 days?
Well, again, right. This was, each particular case may have been maybe a little different. By the time I went, there was like 125 in one car, but most of them were 125 to 135 people per car. But you're talking about women, children, old, young, to show you how they really didn't leave anybody behind. I had one uncle, he was on a sanitarium, he had TB. He was very sick, he was actually dying. Do you know they picked him up on a stretcher and brought him into the ghetto? And he died there anyway. The point is, they wouldn't even leave him behind. No Jewish person was left behind, no matter what. And we were thinking, my father was not exactly a docile man. He didn't want to like to be pushed around, and we were raised like that. And but there was no place to go. You didn't know whom to trust. Now it's odd because the population where we lived, they were all against the Hungarians or against the Nazis, because they were Russian, and they were looked down upon and so on. And we were good neighbors. We lived together, but when push came to shove, we could not trust them or anything. Anything we had to do, believe it or not, we used to do. Like I say, I was like at that time already 13, going up 14. I had a big brother. He was very capable. He was like not afraid of anything and so on. And so I was his helper, and we used to go during the night. Anything we had to do that was not exactly legal or whatever, and you had to do all kinds of things just to make a living, because they took away your livelihood and everything. So, but we could not trust our own neighbors. We never knew who was going to give you up to the police. And this is a tragic thing from my way of looking at it, because now that so many years are behind me, I'm not even judgmental, but for a long time I was. And the reason being is because had it been reversed, I know we would have acted differently. And is that to make myself feel good? I don't think so, but it's a matter of value in your family. I think we would have. But instead, we couldn't even trust them, our own neighbors. And again, they never did anything bad to us. We lived among them, we went to school with them. And that you couldn't trust your immediate area, neighbors, is sad,
So you were in Auschwitz for how long?
I was in Auschwitz, believe it or not, a little over a week, okay? When I came to Auschwitz, again, we didn't know about Auschwitz till we got there. And we had no idea what's going to take place until the following morning. After we went through the showers and they gave us the new clothes, they took us to a barrack. And while we were going through the process of, to get our new clothes and shower and shave and so on, we came to the barrack. We found out what happened to our families. Our families were already up in smoke. Okay, that's the first time I ever heard the word crematorium. It was never used in our vocabulary. We just didn't know about a crematorium. And so we saw these big chimneys, and we wondered what they were. Plus, the flesh was burning. You could smell it. But more than that, when we got out of the barracks early in the morning, when we came to the barracks, I should say, it was, by the way, all the processing took place during the night, because we arrived in Auschwitz, must have been like around midnight. So when we came to the barracks, we saw these big flames under pine trees, huge, huge flames. Not only the crematoriums, that was separate, but these were huge flames outside, like on a field, not far from us, actually, like from here to maybe to that building across the street, not that far. But we couldn't see anything, but we saw the flames reaching high into the sky. And we found out that what they were doing is burning the bodies there and all this thing. And that's when we finally realized where we were, that we were in Auschwitz and what it was about. And from there on in, I don't know how to explain this. Your whole mental state goes into a like overdrive or underdrive, whatever you want to call it. It's like you get so numb, you don't cry, you don't complain, you just go along whatever happens. And we found out that because the capacity, the transportation from Hungary was coming so many trains a day, and they were the killing rate was like about 12,000 a day, okay? So the crematoriums couldn't handle the volume, so they would use the pits outside, and they were burning the bodies over there. And believe it or not, I found out later in the museum actually that they even had it figured out that if they use, because of the body fat and all this, everything was figured out scientific. They could burn X amount of bodies a day in a 24-hour period. They had it down to a science, because of the body fat and all this. And then when I saw this someplace, I said to myself, it just boggles your mind that people could think in those terms, So that was, but I was in Auschwitz, like I mentioned before, just about a little over a week. And we got orders to be shipped out. And so I was among them. A lot of them were kept there. And by the way, when we got to Auschwitz, we were separated. I had an older brother. He was separated from me immediately. But my father and I have some uncles and a couple of cousins. We somehow went in the same group. So we went to, we ended up in a place called Mauthausen. It's in Austria. I'm not going to go into details till we got there, but the point is that as soon as we heard about the atrocities, we figured it's just a matter of time they're going to do it to us. We were sort of resigned to it. I mean, we knew we were never going to come out alive. That much we understood. So we came to Mauthausen, and when we pulled up, the train stopped alongside the mountain. There was a big, Mauthausen was built on a big mountaintop. It was a stone quarry. And they were mining the stone from the quarry, but the camp itself was right on top of the mountain. And we marched up to the top of the mountain, and we came into this camp, and it was much different than Auschwitz, to us, because in Auschwitz, which I should have mentioned, we came to Auschwitz, it was in the spring of the year, and the weather was absolutely horrid. It was cold, miserable. I can't explain it. The whole vision before your eyes. It's like, you ever seen was it Alfred Munch painting? Like very, very disturbing. But we had to stay out. As soon as you went into the barracks at night, and at like 5 o'clock in the morning, they blow a whistle, you'd have to run out. And it was so cold and miserable, raining, misty, no grass, everything was like gravel or mud, no birds, nothing alive. That we huddled like 15, 20 of us because we had these striped clothes and they're like the weight of pajamas, literally, to keep ourselves warm because your teeth were chattering. And that was the only way we were able to keep warm. And the reason I mentioned this, when we came to Mauthausen, it was the exact opposite. We came into Mauthausen, the camp, the weather was on top of the mountain and the sun was hot, bright. The weather was gorgeous. The same thing though, we had to stay outside from morning till night. And it was, like I say, even though it was only an early part of the, it was in the spring, we, you just couldn't take the sun that much. Okay, it was just hot. And I developed some kind of a infection, my eye infection. And by the way, that lasted me throughout the camp. So much so that if I went to sleep, I got up, I couldn't open my eyes. My eyes would like glued together. And that lasted throughout the war. And it took me like 2-3 years to get medical treatment to be able to keep my eyes open. So, but Mauthausen was a little different. And I might add this to it. A few years ago, I don't know, must have been like 6, 7 years ago, maybe 8 years ago, I went with a group of students to Auschwitz. It was an international group of students. And they asked me to go with them. So I went with this group of students. And when I came to Auschwitz, the weather, it was the same exact time of the year that when I went my first entrance to Auschwitz, the same time of the year. This time the weather was gorgeous. It was beautiful spring day. Grass where there was nothing, only gravel the weather was gorgeous. I could not believe I was in the same place, the same time of the year. By coincidence, it was the same time of the year. And until this day, I could never quite understand how I was in the same place, the same time of the year, and how vast different the weather was. That this time it didn't matter, but at that time it did make a difference.
I'm just stunned listening to you. Having survived that, did you ever wonder why you survived and a lot of others didn't, or because you thought you were going to die?
No, we all tried. To put it simply, to be realistic, and I'm not exaggerating, we just never expected to make it out alive. It's just that simple. Because we knew that if the war was, we knew they're going to lose already by that time. But we knew they're not going to let us alive just for the sake of that. They wouldn't want the story to be told. We figured that out. And it was a kind of a thing, it was a foregone conclusion that we didn't expect to come out alive. It was a given at that time because we saw what was happening.
So you were in Auschwitz and then Mauthausen?
Mauthausen. And Mauthausen, I didn't stay in Mauthausen too long. Mauthausen had a lot of sub-camps, about 40 of them, I think. And when I came to Mauthausen, I was there a very short time, and we were shipped out to a camp called Melk, also in Austria, but not far from, actually, Melk turned out to be about 60 kilometers from Vienna. So it was in between. But Melk was a very beautiful, beautiful town, like picture postcard with castles on the side of the mountain. And the reason I know that is because we had to march to go to work. So we had to march through town. And so we used to see these beautiful, on the Danube, the beautiful little castles and thing with the churches. And we couldn't believe that we were in this predicament in such a beautiful place. And I remember you couldn't help but notice it. And but anyway, Melk was a sub camp, and it was used for. We were building tunnels under the mountains for future factories, because they were being bombed, and they were going to put the factories underground to be safe. So we were working on very high rate of speed. In fact, in less than a year, we built like 7 tunnels. Well, of course, they were never finished, but they were. So we were working extremely hard under the worst possible conditions. And of course, the food was always, the one thing you always were is hungry. There was this constant hunger pang. You know, they just. I always nobody should ever know. As a matter of fact, the hunger was so severe that I remember saying to someone next to me that all I would want is a loaf of bread and eat as much as I want to, but not act like a pig and eat the whole thing, just eat as much as I need. Then they could take me to front of a firing squad. I would go on willingly. And I remember distinctly saying that. Now with so many years behind me, I almost feel it's melodramatic, but at the time, I really meant it. So it gives you a very good idea of how, you know, the conditions were.
How thin did you get? What did you weigh when you got out of there? Do you remember?
Well, I was barely alive. Okay, let's put it this way. I don't remember exactly, because you have to remember I was younger, so your weight is different. I can't.
Was it like some of the pictures you see?
Yes, like some of the pictures. Most people were like that. But what happened is that with me, I was in Melk, and we went through all these things. By the way, my father was there, except I didn't see him too often because he was in a different part of the camp. He was in a different work unit, so we didn't get together too often. And he died there, actually. One day I came home and they told me he died, supposedly from pneumonia. Oddly enough, you know, they kept such good records that now, I don't know if you heard of Mauthausen, no? They have the records in a museum they brought in from Germany. They found a bunch of records of all the inmates that were entered into the concentration camp. And believe it or not, they found my father's records with his date of birth, with his date of death, and was the right date. And they even have a marked died of pneumonia, which is because I had an uncle who was with him. My uncle told me he died of pneumonia, okay? And I only found out afterwards. And it's amazing, they had a record of everything, okay? Like I found my records, and I didn't find it, the museum found it. And it even gives you a description, like I was a young student. They named that, they said my nose was long, my eyes were blue, your ears, the size of your ears, I swear, I cannot believe it. All handwritten. Just incredible, the records they kept. So it gives you an idea. But
I heard that the people that went in the gas chambers, though, there was no records. Is that true?
probably not, because they just took them in bulk. You know, they just took them over there and they just disappeared. You know, they were gone.
Now, you mentioned you didn't talk about this for years.
No, absolutely nothing.
What made you decide that you wanted to start talking?
Believe me, what made me decide is, like in my family, my children grew up, but they never heard me speak about it. My daughter, actually, I used to live in New Jersey, okay? And 95, I moved to Washington, to this area, Bethesda. And it took me 3 years just to get into the museum. Each time I went, at that time the museum was very popular. Everybody's talking about it. You couldn't even get tickets to get in. That's how busy they were. And I got to the corner of the museum on 14th Street, and believe it or not, every time I got there, I turned around and walked away. I didn't want to go in. Finally, one day I said to my wife, you know, I have to go in. I mean, everybody's talking about it. I have to go in. So I forced myself to go in. And once I was inside, one of the people there somehow started talking to me, got hold of me. You have to come to survivors group. I said, what? I never heard this, the survivors group. Sounds funny. I only live in New Jersey, but never heard of survivors group. And so he says, come to a meeting. So I started going to a meeting. Before you know it, I sort of like got sucked into it, you know, and I started volunteering, actually. I can't believe that I'm doing it either.
Can I ask that, I've asked some of the other survivors, but you obviously have gone through the museum.
Yeah.
Is there a particular part or exhibit that is more meaningful to you or, you know, affects you the most?
Yeah, actually, it's a very funny thing. There are different times, different things set me off. So I have no explanation. Obviously, as if you know, I get very emotional.
That's all right.
There's one picture there. Are you familiar? Did you go to the museum? When you first come in on the fourth floor, there's a picture there of a very thin man with a bow. Believe it or not, that picture, to me, is one of the most unique pictures in the museum. And so you understand why I'm saying this. The man looks thin. A lot of people look thin. He looks undernourished and so on. But the bowl, the way he holds the bowl, I often say, each time I take a tour, I always point out the bowl. I make a big issue over it. And I use an analogy that I created for myself. That bowl was so important to the man at the time that I use this analogy that if someone came up with a $10,000 diamond and said, look, here's a diamond, it's worth $10,000, but I need a bowl very badly. Take it, give me the bowl. The man wouldn't even answer you. He would literally just turn around and walk away from you. Now, what's the big deal about beating that bowl? So I tried to explain to him, even without that bowl, even the slop or the little broth that you got from sugar beet or whatever, even that he couldn't get without the bowl. So the bowl, consequently, went with you like we used to have a string around a bowl, around our waist, and the bowl was tied to it. That bowl went to you with a latrine. They went to you to sleep. I used the bowl for a pillow. I was just to give an idea. We didn't have any pillows, naturally. Because nobody should steal the bowl from you. That was the most vital piece of property that you owned. Not counting shoes, if you were lucky to have a pair. But so that, and I often wonder who the photographer was, because he must have known what I just told you. You know, I probably could find out who it was. I should ask the museum. But I'm always amazed that he captured that particular picture, because to me that picture is one of the most striking pictures in the museum. A simple thing like a bowl. There are other places, the same thing. Like.
Can you tell me, we're getting towards the end, but can you tell me a little bit about being liberated? And was there a liberation day for you?
Yes.
And who liberated you?
I was liberated by the Americans, and on actually May 5th, 1945. And we were liberated. We didn't even know we were liberated. And when we found out we were liberated, we were afraid to walk out of the camp. We thought it was a trap, that they'll have machine guns lined up outside and they'll shoot us. Again, we just couldn't believe that they would let us go. Now, as it turned out, we were not exactly wrong. So we spent actually an extra night in camp before we walked out because we really were afraid to walk out. And we didn't see an American, although Americans liberated us, but we didn't see one. So we had no way being 100% sure. But what we did find out afterwards, it appears that the guards left. We saw that, by the way, the guards left the following morning. But we found out that when the SS ran off, they left somebody else in charge, like a Wehrmacht officer in charge. And what he chose to do, he took some elders from the camp and they went on a jeep to greet the Americans. And he had orders, he showed them written orders that he was supposed to kill everybody. Okay, so we were not far off of the way we were thinking. But he chose not to do it. And obviously he saved his own skin. But nevertheless, we found that out later, okay? So this is when we were liberated. And, but initially, we were literally afraid to walk out that we're going to be shot. So we were not exactly off the beaten path in terms of thinking that way.
Would it be really fair to ask you how you felt when you realized that you were free?
Yeah, actually it was very simple. Obviously, we must have been joyful, although there was very little joy because we were also very hungry. And when you're hungry, again, you don't think of freedom, you think of food. So our first thing was to look for food, okay? Curiously enough, I'll add a little something to you, to the story. When I was in Milk, I was with a cousin of mine, actually two cousins, one of them died there. But his brother and I were close in age, and we were in Milk the whole time. But towards the end, when we came to the forced march, he was separated. He went to a different place, and I went to a different place. And after the forced march, I ended up in this camp Gunskirchen, which is near Linz. And of all the people, I mentioned to you the labor battalions. His brother was in the labor battalion in Hungary. As the Hungarians were retreating with the Germans, they brought in his group or his company of men into Gunskirchen, and they threw them in the camp. So they were still in fairly good shape. They had their own shoes, they had their own clothes, they had blankets. So they were, compared to us, we were barely alive. They were still in fairly good shape. They were only there a short time. And so of all the places, I came to Gunskirchen when already, by that time we were at, like, I wouldn't have given you, if I was a betting man, I wouldn't bet against, I would have bet against me that I'm not going to live another week, okay? Who of all people do I run into but his brother, his older brother, in this particular camp? And until this day, I can't tell you, if I was a very religious person, I say, God guided me there. However, I'm very realistic about these things. Like you asked me before about how I feel that I survived and somebody else didn't. I never even give it a thought because it has nothing to do with me. It has to do, some people did, some people didn't. It hasn't to do with any stars. It doesn't have to do, I hate to say it, not with God or not with anybody. It has to do that you have X amount of people, some people make it, some people don't. So anyway, I ran into this cousin of mine, and he had a couple of buddies. They were all the same age. And I hooked up with them, and that's how we walked out of the camp looking for food together. So.
Oh, man. What does freedom mean to you?
To me, freedom means just about everything. To me, if you're not free, it's not worth living. And not only because of my experience, but I always felt that way from the time I was very young for some reason. As a matter of fact, after the war, I went back because I was looking for family who survived. So my first thing was when I was, after about 2-3 weeks in an American camp, they deloused us, they nursed us back to health. Although, something else. I got very sick, and I didn't think I was going to make it afterwards either. But when I came back, we were hoping, the rumor was that all the borders will revert back to 1938. And so Czechoslovakia will be a whole Czechoslovakia again and so on. But I went back initially just to find out who was alive, okay? So I wanted to go back to my hometown. Not only that, but you needed papers. In Europe, especially with Russians, they were just like the Germans. Without papers, you cannot go from Bethesda to Washington. You have to have papers, working papers. You have to have everything. You want to spend the night with your relatives in Boston, you come in, you better check with the police first. You know, this is the way it was at that time. So I needed papers. I needed a birth certificate, to put it bluntly. So I went back to, in the meantime, when I came back, I did find one brother, okay, that he was in a labor battalion. He escaped, so he already had set up housekeeping. Anyway, we were, even as much as we didn't want to live under Russia, but you know, Russia's a country, you know. They liberated Europe, so what are you going to do? But at that time, we were hoping that it was going to revert back to Czechoslovakia. But then we found out that the Russians are not giving up that part, they're going to keep it. As soon as we found out they're going to keep it, you know what the first thing we did? And even though I was like 16 by this time, we escaped immediately, okay, to the Czech Republic. And when I was in the Czech Republic in 1946, yeah. The whole thing took place in such a short time, I can't believe it was all done so fast. And we escaped to the Czech Republic, and then I found I had a sister, she was smarter, she came to the Czech Republic, she stayed there, okay? So we sort of reunited with her. There was 3 of us by now, and out of 9. At any rate, once I came to the Czech Republic, I realized how smart, that was the smartest thing I ever did. But the most of it was because I didn't want to live under Russian rule. I could not picture myself living that a government will tell you what to do, where to work, what kind of profession you should go into. And somehow or another, as a 16-year-old, I just figured it out that it was not exactly. And I was not against the communists, I was not against anything like this, because that was the last thing I would worry about. But I figured out that that's not free, okay? That freedom has to be something you have to have.
Wow. Was it hard to talk to me today, or I mean, you've shared this story before, right?
Yeah, I shared it before, but each time it's, even so many years later, I still have difficulty.
Well, I'm very grateful that you've shared this with me. I'm assuming Ellen sent out the email, or somehow you found out about what.
Yeah, no, Ellen sent me the email. Yeah.
And I'm stunned. I don't know what else to ask you.
Well,
I think you've really covered a lot of information.
Well, I know I skipped and jumped a little bit. I tried to give you a little feeling.
As you talk, I'm trying to just imagine some of the things, and I guess one aspect that I have addressed with some of the other survivors is, you know, did you pray when it was tough? Were you a praying man, or no? No,
until this day, I'm not exactly a praying man. I believe in man. I believe in that we are, how can I put it, we are, if you want to be good, you're good. If I have to do it because I'm afraid of God, then I'm in trouble. I mean, that's my, you know, I believe in goodness of man, or I have high hopes for man, you know. But I'll tell you what, we were all raised very orthodox and very religious. You know, used to pray every day, 3 times a day, and all that stuff. I grew up with it. So I could, even though I was very young, but I could, you know, I know enough about it. I could have a discussion about it or anything, or go into details. But everybody chooses their own path. And as soon as even during the war itself, like people, you know, there's an old saying, in a foxhole, every man is a...
There's no atheist in a foxhole.
Right, which is a bunch of baloney. They don't know what they're talking about. What it is, it's up to you. You know, what is, I found out that it's more what man does rather than what anything else does. And I learned that you have to depend on yourself rather than whatever.
But before the Holocaust, did you pray? Did you?
Oh yeah, I'm
believe-
telling you, we grew up automatically. Everybody where we lived was Orthodox, very observant. When I say observant, I mean observant by the book. Like a Jewish person would not, if you came, I use this as an analogy, if you came up to my father and he had an item, let's say he had a horse, and on the Bible it says that on the Sabbath you're supposed to rest. Even your animals are supposed to rest. Somebody would come up and say, look, your horse is worth $10 a day for rental. I'll give you 50. Can I use your horse? And my father was not extreme, he was religious, but he was not a fanatic by any means. He would walk away from me. He wouldn't bother discussing it with you. It was a non-issue, okay? It says that the horse is supposed to rest, that's it. So we were very observant, okay? But when the war was over, I just adopted this, I never thought about it too much. I just got to be so-called irreligious, I guess, you know.
One more question. We got about 30 seconds. Are you afraid to die today? I mean, I know you talked about death back then, but what does it mean what does death mean today to you?
To me, that is one of those things that's inevitable. We live, we die. So I'm very matter of fact about it. Maybe when time comes, I'll change my mind. I don't know, but I'm very matter of fact about it. I said we all have to part sometimes, you know. But I lived long enough now that I could say that, you know, I'm okay with it.